now I can turn it around and have a look at the writing that's been hiding underneath.
So no one's seen that writing for 4,000 or 5,000 years?
Yeah, the only person that's seen it previously is the one who wrote it.
Imagine standing at the edge of a secret so enormous that knowing it changes everything. Not just history, not just science, everything. What you believe about where you came from, why you're here, who, or what put you here. Now imagine that secret was carved into stone tablets over 6,000 years ago, buried in the ruins of a civilization so advanced it shouldn't have existed. And for millennia, no living human could read it. Until now. In 2025, artificial intelligence did something scholars couldn't do in 2 centuries of trying. It cracked the code. It translated fragmented Sumerian cuneiform texts in ways no human linguist ever could, connecting fragments across thousands of tablets, cross-referencing symbols, reconstructing meaning from clay shards that time had nearly destroyed. And what it found wasn't mythology, it wasn't poetry, it was a manual for building a species. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear is going to challenge everything you thought you knew about what it means to be human, long before Egypt, long before Rome, long before any civilization we celebrate in textbooks. There was Sumer. Situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now modern-day Iraq, Sumer emerged around 4,500 BCE as the world's first complex civilization. They built cities when others lived in tents. They invented writing, mathematics, astronomy, and legal codes, while the rest of humanity was still scratching symbols into cave walls. And they left behind something extraordinary: over 500,000 clay tablets inscribed with a writing system called cuneiform, tiny, wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay and baked by the sun. For centuries, scholars were baffled. The tablets spoke of gods called the Anunnaki, of cosmic battles, of floods and creation, of beings descending from the heavens. Most academics categorize these as religious mythology. Ancient people trying to explain the world through story. But there was always something unsettling about the Sumerian texts that made that explanation feel insufficient. The details were too specific, the technical language too precise, the descriptions of processes, biological processes, too structured to be pure fiction. Scholars like Zechariah Sitchin spent decades arguing that the texts were being misread. They described actual historical events rather than allegory. But translating ancient Sumerian is extraordinarily difficult. Many tablets are broken, symbols shift in meaning across time and region. Context is often missing entirely. Human translators, no matter how brilliant, could only work piece by piece. One tablet at a time, one fragment at a time. What they needed was a mind that could hold all of it at once. In early 2025, a coalition of computational archaeologists and AI researchers from institutions in the US, Israel, and Germany deployed a large language model specifically trained on ancient Near Eastern languages: Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, cross-referenced against every archaeological record, lexicon, and comparative mythology database available. This wasn't the first AI to attempt cuneiform translation, but it was the first trained to do something radically different. Instead of translating tablet by tablet, it mapped relationships, recognizing when a fragment from a tablet excavated in Nippur matched conceptually, structurally, and linguistically with a fragment from a different site discovered 50 years later. It stitched together the world's oldest puzzle using pattern recognition that would take human scholars multiple lifetimes. The results began emerging over several weeks. First came the confirmations. Things scholars already suspected, now rendered in sharper focus. Administrative records, agricultural data, star charts of stunning accuracy. But then came something else. Buried in a cluster of tablets primarily associated with the EDIN archives. Tablets largely overlooked because they were considered ritual texts. The AI flagged an anomaly. The language in these passages wasn't religious. It wasn't ceremonial. It was procedural. Step by step. Clinical. Deliberate. It described the creation of what the Sumerians called Lulu, a term loosely translated as the mixed one or the primitive worker. But the AI's contextual analysis revealed layers of meaning no prior translation had captured. Lulu wasn't just a servant. It was a product, and the process of making it, disturbingly familiar. According to the AI's translation, the Anunnaki, Sumerian, described consistently as beings who came from the sky, faced a crisis. They had arrived on Earth with a mission. The text suggests they were mining gold, a resource described as essential for reasons the tablets don't fully explain. Some researchers have theorized this was for atmospheric purposes on their home world. Others believe it was purely economic within some larger interstellar framework. Whatever the reason, the labor was exhausting their own people, so they created workers. The tablets describe a process involving the essence of those who came before, received and interpreted by the AI as genetic material, combined with the clay of the earth, the biological raw material of native hominids already present on the planet. The overseer of this process was a figure named Enki, described as a master of what the texts call Namlu Ula, the science of living forms. What's deeply unsettling here isn't the mythology, it's the vocabulary. The AI flagged repeated use of terminology that maps directly onto biological concepts: mixing, dividing, testing, discarding, failed attempts. One passage describes creating beings that couldn't survive exposure to sunlight. Another describes a batch without functioning reproductive organs, like called in the original text those who do not multiply, kept deliberately sterile so the population could only grow at the Anunnaki's discretion. Think about that. The first humans, according to these texts, were engineered without the ability to reproduce. Absolute dependency, absolute control. And the creation wasn't one event. It was a process. The AI identified references to at least 7 distinct iterations of the Lulu, or Thurzitl, early human models, each adjusted, refined, or abandoned. Some were too aggressive. Some were cognitively limited in ways that made them useless. Some had physiological defects. The texts describe these failed versions being returned to clay, a phrase whose clinical coldness, the researchers noted, made the room go quiet when it was first read aloud. Here's where the AI's findings become not just strange, but deeply, viscerally disturbing, because the tablets don't describe a single human template. They describe categories. Different groups of humans, according to these passages, were created for different functions. One category was designed for physical labor, Lates Prokmal Baber Baistru, built, with greater endurance, less cognitive complexity, easier to manage. Another category was designated for organization, record-keeping, and coordination, given more abstract reasoning ability to oversee the workers. A third, mentioned with a reverence bordering on the sacred, was designated as intermediaries, beings capable of communicating with the Anunnaki directly. The AI's translation mapped these categories to terms used across multiple tablets with striking consistency. These weren't incidental references. They appeared to be classifications. Stable, deliberate categories embedded into the very structure of human society from the beginning. The implications are staggering, and deeply uncomfortable. Because if this translation is accurate, the divisions that human beings have spent millennia fighting over, dying over, enslaving each other over, divisions of class, of caste, of perceived hierarchy, or may not have emerged naturally from culture or circumstance. They may have been engineered, written into biology before we had words for biology. We like to believe that inequality is a human failure, a moral wrong we can correct. But what if, according to these texts, inequality wasn't an accident? What if it was the architecture? Not all the gods agreed with what was being done. The Sumerian texts have always described a tension between 2 primary divine figures, Enki and his brother Enlil. In older translations, this was read as a sibling rivalry, petty divine politics. The AI's synthesis reveals something far more significant. Enki, the architect of humanity, appears throughout the tablets as a complicated figure, proud of his creation, increasingly protective of it. There are passages where he refers to humanity with language that the AI translates most accurately as affection. He described humans as his children, and over time he began giving them things they were never supposed to have: knowledge, autonomy, reproductive capability. The gift of reproduction, called Namti in the texts, the breath of life, appears to have been given to humanity covertly against explicit instruction. This act mirrors the Garden of Eden narrative with uncomfortable precision, and the AI's cross-referencing suggests these stories share a common origin in the same set of historical events. Enlil's response to this was what the texts describe with unmistakable clarity: fury. Enlil didn't see humans as children. He saw them as tools, and tools that gained independence were not upgraded tools. They were defective tools. They were dangerous ones. The conflict between these two figures runs like a fault line through all of Sumerian religious writing. Enki continuously working to elevate humanity, Enlil continuously working to contain, diminish, and ultimately destroy it, and Enlil at least once. Nearly one. The Great Flood appears in the Sumerian texts long before it appears in the Bible. In the Sumerian version, the story of Ziusudra, later echoed as Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The flood is not a natural disaster. It is a vote. The AI's translation of a previously fragmented section of the Atrahasis epic renders what appears to be a divine council. The Anunnaki gathering to deliberate on what to do about the human population that had grown beyond its intended parameters. They were too numerous, too noisy, too aware. The decision was made. A flood? Global? Final? Humanity was to be reset. But Enki refused to accept it. In direct defiance of the council's ruling, he found a man, Ziusudra in the Sumerian tradition, Athwais, and warned him, told him what was coming, gave him the knowledge to survive. The AI flagged something extraordinary in this section. The warning wasn't just about building a boat. The texts contain what appears to be instructions for preserving biological material, seeds, animals, and something described as the essence of the living kinds, in a way that suggests not just physical survival, but the preservation of genetic diversity. The flood in this reading wasn't just survived, it was anticipated, and the survivors weren't chosen randomly. They were selected, which raises a question that the researchers found impossible to dismiss. If the flood was a reset and the survivors were specifically chosen, what were they chosen for? What did the next phase of the human project require that prompted this particular selection? As the AI continued its synthesis, researchers began encountering descriptions that had no business being in 4,000-year-old texts. Flying vehicles described with aerodynamic specificity. Not winged mythical creatures, but craft with chambers with propulsion mechanisms described in terms the AI flagged as analogous to thrust and pressure dynamics. Weapons that used concentrated energy, not fire, not arrows, but directed force described in language that the AI translated most precisely as beams of focused light. Medical procedures involving the manipulation of what the texts call the invisible thread of life, a phrase the AI contextually linked to genetic sequencing with a confidence rating that stunned the research team. These weren't metaphors. The linguistic analysis was clear. The Sumerians didn't have a tradition of using this kind of technical, procedural language for symbolic purposes. When they wrote symbolically, they wrote symbolically. When they wrote practically, they wrote practically. These passages were practical, which means one of two possibilities must be true. Either the Sumerians were describing technologies given to them by beings who actually possessed them, the Anunnaki as literal advanced entities rather than metaphorical gods, or someone thousands of years ago was writing science fiction so accurate that it reads in AI translation as technical documentation. Neither option is particularly comforting. Throughout multiple tablet collections, where Stamper would have fought to do from Nippur, from Eridu, from Uruk, the AI identified consistent references to a celestial object called Nibiru. In older scholarship, Nibiru was thought to be a poetic reference to Jupiter, or perhaps a conjunction point in astronomical charts. But the AI's cross-analysis of all Nibiru references across the complete corpus revealed a pattern that resisted that interpretation. Nibiru is described as a body, a large one, on an elongated orbit that brings it through the inner solar system at intervals the tablets calculate as approximately 3,600 years. Its arrivals are not celebrated. They are feared. The texts associate Nibiru's return with upheaval, geological, social, cosmic, with the arrival of the Anunnaki, with divine intervention in human affairs, with what one passage in the OI's most startling translation describes as the testing of the harvest. That phrase, the testing of the harvest, appears in 4 separate tablet collections, always in association with Nibiru's return. The AI's semantic analysis suggests it refers to an evaluation, an assessment of humanity, whether what has been built still serves its intended purpose, whether it needs to be adjusted, or whether it needs to be reset again. The last calculated arrival of Nibiru, according to the tablet's own astronomical records, aligns with a period several thousand years ago, which means if the orbital calculation is accurate, the next return is not in the distant future. It is approaching. And according to the oldest written record of human history, the one we are only now finally able to read. When it arrives, something happens. Something that has happened before. Let's step back from the tablets for a moment. Let's step back from the AI, from the translations, from the fragments and the cuneiform and the ancient archives of a civilization that vanished so completely it seems almost deliberate. And let's ask the question that all of this is really building toward. What if the story of humanity, the real story, not the one we tell ourselves, is not a story of evolution toward freedom? What if it's a story of management? And what if the hierarchies we've never been able to dissolve, the inequalities we've never been able to fully explain with culture or economics alone, the strange, persistent feeling so many humans carry that they are somehow here to serve something larger than themselves? What if none of that is coincidence? What if it's inheritance? The Sumerian texts, as translated by AI, describe a humanity that was built in stages, divided by function, granted just enough autonomy to be useful and never quite enough to be free. They describe gods who disagreed about how much we should know and what we should be allowed to become. They describe a flood that wasn't a punishment, it was a correction. And they describe a cosmic mechanism, a returning body in the sky, whose arrival triggers a reckoning. For 6,000 years, this was carved in clay. And for 6,000 years, we couldn't read it. Now we can. And maybe that timing isn't coincidence either. Maybe this knowledge was always going to emerge precisely when humanity had built a mind sophisticated enough to find it. A machine capable of stitching together fragments, of seeing what human eyes were too close, too small, too mortal to see. Maybe we were always going to reach this moment. The question is what we do with it, because here's the most unsettling possibility of all. More unsettling than genetic engineering, more unsettling than ancient flying machines, more unsettling even than a planet-sized body on a collision course with our reckoning. What if we were designed to ask this exact question at exactly this moment and still not be able to change the answer? What if knowing is not the same as being free? What if the most sophisticated cage ever built is one where the prisoner understands, completely and in perfect detail, every bar, every lock, every dimension of their confinement, and still cannot leave? The clay tablets are speaking. For the first time in 6,000 years, we can hear them. What they're saying is that they expected us